Hello, young soul. Welcome to the Daily Horror Channel. If you are afraid of real and scary reports, this channel is not for you. I suggest you leave this video, but if you are not afraid of listening to these horrifying reports, I suggest you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. In the heart of the city of Miraval, surrounded by towering mountains and dense forests, stands the Hotel Montclair, an architectural gem from the 1920s that was once a symbol of luxury and opulence. Over the years, the grandeur of the hotel was forgotten, and it became a refuge for those seeking isolation. The few guests who ventured there were drawn by the promise of tranquility and natural beauty, but few knew the dark secrets the hotel walls held. Among these guests was Julia, a thriller writer who, facing a creative block, decided to stay at the Montclair in search of inspiration. What she didn't know was that this search for creativity would lead her to an unimaginable nightmare. When I arrived at the Hotel Montclair, dusk was falling, casting long, menacing shadows across the imposing facade. The wind blew gently, carrying with it the smell of pine and damp. My flashlight was the only source of light as I pushed open the rusty iron gate, which creaked loudly as if protesting my presence. My heart was beating fast, but my determination to unlock my creativity and uncover the secrets that haunted the hotel was stronger than my fear. I entered the hotel and the air immediately became colder. The sound of the wind seemed amplified through the empty hallways, creating an ominous melody that echoed around me. My name is Julia, and since I was a child, I have always been fascinated by mystery and horror stories. My grandfather used to talk about his adventures in places forgotten by time, and it was he who inspired me to pursue a career as a writer. The Hotel Montclair was one of those places that always intrigued me. Rumors of a missing, shifting room and reports of disturbing sights and unexplained sounds drew me in, and I was determined to discover the truth. As I walked through the halls, the flashlight illuminated scenes from a time gone by. Faded Persian rugs, antique furniture covered in dust, and paintings on the walls, depicting landscapes and figures that seemed to watch me with empty eyes. I began exploring, taking photos and capturing the unsettling silence that seemed to swallow everything around me. I passed through the main hall, where crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, now unlit and dusty. The air was filled with a feeling of abandonment, but also with an invisible presence that seemed to be watching my every move. I continued walking until I reached reception, where a large wooden counter was covered in old records. I flipped through some guest books, hoping to find some clue about the missing room. As I looked through the records, I heard a soft, distant sound, like the scratching of fingernails on a chalkboard. My heart quickened, and I followed the sound cautiously. The corridor in front of me seemed to stretch infinitely long, and shadows danced on the walls. Every step I took seemed to echo for eternity. I climbed the stairs carefully, trying not to make any noise. When I reached the second floor, the feeling of oppression increased. The walls seemed to close in around me and the air was thick. I saw a door ajar, and hesitantly, I pushed it open. The room was an old suite, with a four-poster bed and luxurious furniture, now covered in dust and decay. In the background, a metal cabinet was partially open, and something inside seemed to be moving. I approached the closet, feeling a chill run down my spine. I opened the door with a quick movement, and nothing. Just a draft that made the door slam against the wall. The sound I heard earlier now seemed to be everywhere, an indistinct whisper that made the skin crawl. I decided to continue my exploration, determined to discover more. I passed through more hallways and rooms, each one scarier than the last. In one of the rooms, I found an old ballroom. The table was set, as if awaiting guests who would never arrive. In one corner, a grand piano was partially open, and the keys appeared to have been played recently. I touched one of the keys, and a dissonant sound echoed through the room, making my heart skip a beat. The silence was interrupted by the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. I quickly closed the diary and left the room, looking both ways. There was no one there, but the feeling of being watched was intense. I continued walking, following the footsteps that now seemed further away. The corridors seemed endless, each one leading to more rooms full of secrets and horrors. I arrived at an isolated wing of the hotel, where the doors were locked with chains. I managed to pry open one of the doors, and it opened with a loud creak. The room was small and dark, with just a bed and a table. On the table there was a dusty violin. I picked up the violin carefully, feeling a strange energy emanating from it. Suddenly I heard a soft, sad melody, as if someone was playing the violin. The melody seemed to come from inside my head, and a feeling of despair came over me. I put the violin back on the table and left the room, trying to put the music out of my mind. As I walked through the halls, the melody continued, growing louder and more distressing. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, and the whispers returned, louder and clearer. "Help us," said the whispers, over and over again. "Release us." My mind was in turmoil, and the feeling of terror was overwhelming. I kept walking, trying to find a way out, but the hallways felt like a maze. The shadows on the walls became distinct figures, moving and watching me. The cold was increasing, and my body was shaking. I arrived at a large room that appeared to be a special treatment room. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and in the center of the room was an operating table. Surgical instruments were scattered everywhere, and the floor was stained with dried blood. On the opposite wall I saw a large mirror, and as I approached it I saw a figure behind me. I turned quickly and saw the spectral figure of a woman. She had an expression of sadness and pain, and her eyes were fixed on me. "You need to end this," she whispered. "My spirit is trapped here because of the experiments. Find Dr. Mendez's complete diary and destroy it. Only then will I be able to rest." My mind was in turmoil, but I knew I needed to follow his instructions. I went back to the owner's office and looked for more clues. At the back of the bookshelf, I found a secret compartment with more pages from the diary. The notes detailed dark rituals and experiments on patients that went beyond comprehension. With the pages in hand, I returned to the special treatments room. The spectral figure was still there, waiting. I placed the pages on the floor and used one of the surgical instruments to cut them out and burn them. The pages began to disintegrate, and the spectral figure let out a piercing scream before disappearing. The shadows on the walls dissipated, and the violin melody stopped. The feeling of oppression lessened, and the air became lighter. I knew I had freed at least one spirit, but the hotel still held many secrets and horrors. I grabbed my gear and left the hotel, determined never to return. As I walked back to town, the full moon lit my path, casting eerie, unsettling shadows along the road. Although I had managed to free at least one spirit trapped in the Montclair Hotel, I knew that many other souls were still at the mercy of the dark forces there. The battle was far from over, and the relief I felt was quickly replaced by new determination. I got home and immediately locked all the doors and windows. The silence of the night felt heavier than ever, as if the air itself was waiting for something. I decided to review my grandfather's notes again, trying to find some clue that could help me better understand the curse that haunted the hotel. I spent hours reading the remaining pages of the diary, discovering disturbing details about the experiments carried out at the hotel. My grandfather described how he and other doctors tried to cure patients by subjecting them to sensory deprivation treatments, deep hypnosis, and even spiritual reconnection rituals. Many of these experiments resulted in horrific deaths or the unexplained disappearance of patients. As I read, something caught my attention. A mention of a secret room in the hotel's basement where the darkest experiments were carried out. I decided I needed to go back there and find out what was in the secret room. But this time, I wouldn't go alone. I invited my friend Lucas, who has always been skeptical about the supernatural, to accompany me. I told him everything I had discovered, and although he was reluctant, he agreed to help me. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and some tools, we returned to the Hotel Montclair the next night. Upon arrival, the feeling of oppression and fear immediately returned. We entered the hotel, and the cold, thick air enveloped us. We followed the empty corridors, now even more frightening with the presence of Lucas, whose cynical comments failed to dispel the growing tension. We went underground, where the darkness seemed even more intense. We looked for the entrance to the secret room, and finally found it hidden behind a false wall. Upon opening the door, a smell of mold and decay hit us, and we entered cautiously. The secret room was even more disturbing than I imagined. The walls were covered in strange, ancient symbols, and in the center of the room was a large stone circle marked with dried blood. Surgical instruments and other macabre objects were scattered everywhere, and the air was filled with a sense of pure evil. Lucas, trying to maintain his composure, began filming the room with his camera, while I examined the symbols on the walls. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped drastically, and we heard whispers around us. The lights of the flashlights began to flicker, and a dense shadow began to form in the center of the pedestrian circle. The shadow took shape, revealing the spectral figure of a woman, the same one I had seen before. Her gaze was fixed on me, and her eyes shone with a mixture of pain and anger. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice echoing through the room. "The curse is stronger than you imagine. You cannot free us." Before we could react, the figure began to move towards us, and the feeling of oppression increased. The shadows on the walls moved, and the whispers became harrowing screams. Lucas, in a panic, tried to run out, but the room door closed with a bang, locking us inside. "Julia, what's going on?" Lucas shouted, his voice full of fear. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here," I replied, trying to remain calm. "We need to find a way to free these souls." I remembered my grandfather's notes about the spiritual reconnection ritual. We needed to complete the ritual to break the curse. I frantically searched for the diary and found the instructions for the ritual. Lucas and I began following the steps, drawing symbols on the floor and reciting the ancient words. As the ritual progressed, the spectral figure writhed and screamed, and the shadows around us became more aggressive. Finally, with the last word of the ritual, an intense light filled the room, and the spectral figure let out a final scream before disappearing. Silence returned, and the feeling of oppression disappeared. The door to the room opened on its own, and Lucas and I walked out quickly, breathing heavily. We returned to the surface, relieved to be out of that hell. As we walked back to town, I looked at the hotel one last time. I knew there were still many secrets and horrors hidden there, but at least part of the curse had been broken. As we drove home that night, the uneasy feeling never left me. We knew we had accomplished something significant by breaking the violin, but we also understood that the real battle was yet to come. We spent the following days reviewing the recordings and photographs, trying to find some clue that could help us better understand the curse of the Hotel Montclair. One night I received an unexpected phone call. It was Lucas, his voice sounding urgent and tense. "Julia, we need to talk. I discovered something important. Meet me at the city library," he said, before hanging up abruptly. I went to the library, where Lucas was waiting for me with a stack of old books and documents. He looked exhausted but determined. "What did you find?" I asked, sitting down next to him. "I've been researching the history of the hotel and found old records that talk about a talented violinist who mysteriously disappeared during the construction of the hotel. He was obsessed with a melody he said he heard in his dreams. I believed that melody had the power to control the souls of the dead," Lucas explained, handing me one of the books. "So the spirit we saw is the violinist himself?" I asked, intrigued. "It seems so, but there is more. I discovered that the violin we destroyed was just one of the objects he used to channel the power of melody. There are other items scattered throughout the hotel, each connected to a part of the curse," said Lucas, pointing to a map of the hotel with several points marked. "We need to destroy all these items to end the curse once and for all," he concludes, feeling a new wave of determination. We prepare for one last raid on the hotel, this time determined to end the curse once and for all. We return to the Hotel Montclair on a cold, cloudy night, the perfect setting for the final showdown. Armed with flashlights, tools, and the knowledge we had acquired, we began our search for the remaining objects. Every step into the hotel felt heavier, as if an invisible force was trying to stop us. We found the first object, an old music box, buried near the Ferris wheel. Lucas smashed it with a hammer, and a deafening scream echoed through the hotel, followed by an oppressive silence. We continued our search, finding a series of objects, each more disturbing than the last. A porcelain doll with empty eyes, an old clock that still ticked, a framed photograph of a group of smiling children. Each time we destroyed an object, the evil presence in the hotel seemed to weaken, but it also reacted more strongly, making our task increasingly difficult. We reached the last object, a yellowed sheet of music with the melody that the obsessed violinist had written. It was kept in a glass case inside the Hall of Mirrors. As we destroyed it, the spectral figure of the violinist appeared for the last time, more real and terrifying than ever. "You cannot stop me," he shouted, his voice resonating with an unearthly fury. Lucas and I prepared ourselves for the final confrontation. As he distracted the spirit, I ran to the sheet music and tore it to shreds. A powerful wind picked up, and the violinist's figure let out an agonized scream before disappearing into a cloud of shadows. The hotel fell silent, the sense of oppression finally fading. We knew we had done it. The curse had been broken, and the violinist's spirit was finally at peace. I looked at Lucas, and he smiled with relief. "We did it, Julia. We finally did it," he said, hugging me. As we left the Montclair Hotel for the last time, a sense of peace and accomplishment washed over me. The battle had been hard, but we had won. The town of Miraval could finally forget the horrors of the hotel, and I could move on, knowing that I had made a difference. But as I looked back one last time, I saw a shadow moving through the trees. A reminder that true terror never completely disappears. The struggle between light and darkness is eternal, and though we had won that battle, the war against the unknown and the supernatural continued, and I was ready to face whatever the future might bring. As we drove away from the Montclair Hotel, the night seemed darker, as if the world were trying to hide something. Though we had managed to break the main curse, the weight of what we had endured remained. I knew that the sense of tranquility was only temporary. The whispers and shadows of that place had embedded themselves in my mind. We arrived at my house, and Lucas decided to spend the night there, as a mutual safety measure. We locked all the doors and windows and settled into the living room. The familiar surroundings should have comforted us, but we both felt restless. A candle flame flickered on the table, casting dancing shadows on the walls. As we prepared to review our notes and recordings, a soft, familiar sound broke the silence. It was the melody of the violin, played with eerie perfection. Lucas and I exchanged an apprehensive glance, and my heart skipped a beat. The melody seemed to be coming from inside the house. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Lucas nodded, grabbing his flashlight. "We need to find out where it's coming from." We followed the sound, which led us to the basement of my house. The air was heavy and cold, and each footstep seemed to echo in the darkness. I carefully opened the basement door, and the melody grew louder and clearer. We descended the steps, and the sight that awaited us was bone-chilling. In the center of the basement was a circle of lit candles, and in the middle was a spectral figure playing the violin. It was the same spirit as the violinist, now stronger and more defined. Its eyes were pools of darkness, and the expression on its face was one of pure rage. "Do you think you can get rid of me so easily?" the figure whispered, its voice echoing off the walls. "The curse never ends." Lucas and I were paralyzed with fear. The violin's melody echoed in our minds, and the oppression was overwhelming. "We need to do something," Lucas muttered, trying to remain calm. I remembered an old ritual my grandfather had mentioned in his notes, one that could bind a spirit permanently. I quickly began to recite the words of the ritual, drawing symbols on the floor with a piece of chalk. Lucas joined me, following my instructions. As the ritual progressed, the spectral figure writhed and screamed, and the shadows around us grew more aggressive. The temperature dropped dramatically, and the air grew thick with a sense of pure evil. Finally, with the last word of the ritual, a bright light filled the basement, and the spectral figure let out a final scream before disappearing. Silence returned, and the feeling of oppression disappeared. The candles went out, and the air became lighter. We knew we had managed to hold the spirit, but the weight of what we had faced did not disappear. We returned to the living room, exhausted and shaken. "That was intense," Lucas said, still shaking. "Yes, but I think we're finally done with him," I replied, trying to find some comfort in the idea. Over the next few days, the feeling of restlessness lessened but never completely disappeared. Lucas and I continued our research, trying to better understand what we had faced. We discovered that the violinist's spirit was linked to an old local legend about musicians who sold their souls for talent. Although we managed to capture the spirit, we knew that true terror never completely disappears. The struggle between light and darkness is eternal, and there will always be new challenges to be faced. I was ready for whatever the future brought, knowing that true courage comes from facing the unknown head-on. The city of Miraval may have forgotten the horrors of the Hotel Montclair, but I never would. And as the full moon lit up the night sky, I knew I was prepared for whatever battle came, determined to protect those I loved from the shadows that lurk in the dark. But as the night wore on, the feeling of relief turned into a new form of anguish. The nightmares returned, more vivid than ever. I dreamed of the violinist, with his piercing melody and his empty eyes, always watching me. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart beating fast with the feeling that something was wrong. One night, while reviewing my grandfather's notes again, I came across a reference to a specific artifact, an amulet that could break any curse once and for all. Lucas and I decided that we needed to find this amulet. It was our only chance to ensure the curse would never return. We followed the clues left in the notes, which led us to a small village in the mountains, where the amulet was supposedly kept in an old abandoned church. The journey was long and difficult, but we were determined. Upon arriving at the village, we were greeted with suspicion by the few remaining residents. They knew the story of the amulet and the curse associated with it and were reluctant to help us. However, an old priest, the guardian of the church, decided to help us. We entered the church, a dark and oppressive place with religious symbols covering the walls. The priest took us to a hidden altar where the amulet was kept in a glass case. "This amulet was made to protect, but its power is dangerous," he warned us. "Use it wisely." I took the amulet, feeling a wave of energy run through my body. I knew this was the last step to ensuring the curse was broken once and for all. We returned to the Hotel Montclair, ready to face anything. Upon arriving at the hotel, the air felt heavier than ever. We entered and went straight to the basement where we had trapped the violinist's spirit. I placed the amulet in the center of the circle of symbols we had drawn and began to recite the final incantation. As the words echoed through the basement, the temperature dropped drastically and shadows began to stir. The violinist's spirit reappeared, writhing in rage and pain. The amulet's light shined brightly, and the spirit let out an agonizing scream before dissipating completely. The silence that followed was deafening. The feeling of oppression disappeared, replaced by a deep and lasting peace. We knew we had done it. The curse had been definitively broken. The Hotel Montclair was finally free. As we left the hotel for the last time, I looked at Lucas and he smiled. "We did it, Julia. We finally made it." But even as we celebrated our victory, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that true terror never completely disappears. The battle between light and darkness is eternal, and there will always be new challenges to be faced. I was ready for whatever the future brought, determined to protect those I loved from the shadows that lurk in the dark. The city of Miraval may have forgotten the horrors of the Hotel Montclair, but I never would. And as the full moon lit up the night sky, I knew I was prepared for whatever battle came, determined to face the unknown head-on and win, no matter how terrible the darkness lurked in the shadows. We left the Hotel Montclair with the feeling of mission accomplished, but something inside me was still restless. The weight of the curse had been lifted, but the shadows of the past seemed to follow me. Lucas and I returned to my house, trying to put the horrors we faced behind us. However, the night was far from over. As we settled into the room, The atmosphere felt abnormally thick, and the air was charged with static electricity. The candle on the table flickered, casting shadows that danced on the walls, which seemed to take on a life of their own. Lucas tried to relax, but I could see the tension in his eyes. "I need to review these recordings," said Lucas. Taking out his equipment and connecting it to the television, images of the hotel began to play on the screen, and the ambient sound filled the room with a strange reverberation. Suddenly, the screen flickered, and the image became distorted. An indistinct figure appeared in the background, close to the circle of candles where we had performed the ritual. My heart stopped for a moment. It was the violinist. He was back, stronger and more terrifying than ever. "Lucas, look at this." I pointed at the screen, my voice full of dread. Before Lucas could react, the lights began to flicker frantically, and an intense cold invaded the room. The melody of the violin, which we thought had been silenced forever, echoed through the house, each note like a blade cutting through the silence. The shadows on the walls twisted and formed grotesque figures, which seemed to advance towards us. "We need to get out of here," Lucas shouted, his voice full of panic. We tried to get up, but something kept us paralyzed. The doors and windows began to slam violently, as if a storm was brewing inside the house. The spectral figure of the violinist materialized in the room, his presence suffocating and oppressive. His eyes, empty and dark, were fixed on us, and his violin played a despairing melody. "The curse never ends," he whispered, his voice resonating in our minds. The figure began to advance, and the temperature in the room dropped even further. His every step seemed to drain our energy, and the melody became louder and more piercing. Lucas tried to move, but his legs wouldn't respond. I was in shock, unable to look away from the spirit's empty eyes. With extreme effort, I managed to get the amulet that had helped us break the curse at the hotel. I held it tightly, feeling its energy pulse in my hand. "Lucas, the amulet!" I shouted, trying to focus on our last hope. Lucas reached out his hand, and together we held the amulet, reciting the protection spell we had learned. The spectral figure stopped for a moment, and an agonized scream echoed through the room. The shadows began to dissipate, and the violin melody was replaced by a deafening silence. But then, something unexpected happened. The amulet emitted an intense light, but instead of dispelling the spirit, the light turned against us. We felt an overwhelming force pulling us, as if we were being sucked into an abyss. The figure of the violinist smiled sinisterly, as darkness completely enveloped us. We lost consciousness, and when I woke up, I was back at the hotel, in the room of anguish. The place was in ruins, but now I felt like we were trapped there forever. Lucas was next to me, his expression of terror mirroring mine. "We're trapped here," he murmured, voice full of despair. The violin melody began again, and the shadows around us drew closer, forming an oppressive circle. The violinist's spirit reappeared, now more powerful than ever. "The curse is eternal," he said, the voice echoing in our minds. "You will be my companions forever." The shadows swallowed us, and the violin melody became the soundtrack to our eternal nightmare. We were doomed to wander the halls of the Montclair Hotel, trapped in an endless cycle of terror and despair, with no hope of salvation. And so, the true nature of the curse revealed itself. The battle between light and darkness never ends, and sometimes, darkness wins. In a small, peaceful town called Villa Verde, the tranquility of the night was rarely disturbed. The city, surrounded by hills and dense forests, felt like a safe haven away from the hustle and bustle of the modern world. However, not all refugees are safe. Darkness brings with it dark secrets, and Villa Verde was about to discover the price of living in a false paradise. My name is Raphael, I'm a journalist who decided to move to Villa Verde after a burnout. The idea was simple, a calm place to start over, away from the hustle and bustle of big cities. I bought an old house on the outskirts of the city, a charming and rustic building surrounded by tall trees and a wooden fence that was already worn out by time. When I arrived, I was greeted by the few neighbors with smiles and curiosity. They were happy to see a new face in the community. The house, despite being old, had a welcoming atmosphere. The walls were dark wood, the floors creaked slightly underfoot, and the windows offered a serene view of the hills in the distance. On the first night, the silence was absolute. I lay down on the bed, feeling a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. But the tranquility would soon be broken. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound, like something was scratching the wall outside the house. I sat up in bed, trying to hear better, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it started. I convinced myself it was just my imagination and went back to sleep. Over the next few days, I dedicated myself to exploring the city and getting acquainted with the residents. Villa Verde was a picturesque place, with its central square, old church, and little shops that looked like they came out of an old movie. I met Dona Marta, a nice lady who had an antique store. She told me stories about the city, but she always changed the subject when she asked about the history of my house. Her gaze became distant, as if she remembered something she would rather forget. The second night I woke up again to the same scratching sound. This time it felt more intense and closer. I got up, grabbed a flashlight and went to check. I walked around the house, shining light into every corner, but found nothing. I went to the backyard, and the cold night air enveloped me. The shadows of the trees danced to the rhythm of the wind, creating frightening shapes on the ground. There was nothing out there, but the feeling of being watched was palpable. The week passed without any major incidents, until one night, upon returning from dinner at a neighbor's house, I found the door to my house ajar. The air was thick and cold, and the feeling of being watched returned with a vengeance. I entered cautiously, calling my dog's name, Max, but he didn't appear. My heart raced. I looked all over the house until I found him shaking under the bed. Something was definitely wrong. The next day, I decided to investigate the history of the house. I went to the city library and asked to see the old records. The librarian, an elderly woman with a discerning eye, seemed reluctant, but she brought the books. I discovered that the house had belonged to a wealthy family in the early 20th century. The patriarch, Joaquim Silva, was a man obsessed with the occult. Rumors said he performed rituals in the house, trying to communicate with spirits. After the mysterious death of his wife and son, the house was abandoned for decades, until it was sold several times without anyone being able to live in it for long. The pieces started to fall into place. I returned home with a feeling of apprehension. Night fell, and the house seemed even darker. I sat in the living room trying to work, but my mind was in turmoil. I decided to investigate the basement, a place I had previously avoided. I grabbed a flashlight and went downstairs, each step echoing off the pedestrian walls. The basement was cold and damp, with a strong, musty smell. I rummaged through old boxes and dust-covered furniture until I found an old trunk. Inside were occult books, black candles, and a violin. The violin seemed out of place, but as I played it, I felt a wave of cold wash over me. Suddenly I heard a whisper next to me. I quickly turned around, but there was no one. I went back upstairs with the violin. I decided to burn the books and candles, but the violin seemed to be connected to everything in some way. That night, the scratching sound returned, but this time, it came from inside the house. I followed the sound to the attic, a place I had never explored before. The stairs creaked as they climbed, and the air grew colder with each step. When I reached the attic, I felt a presence. In the corner, there was an indistinct figure shrouded in shadows. The figure seemed to play an invisible violin, and the melody was the same as the one he had heard on previous nights. The figure stopped and turned to me, revealing a disfigured face and empty eyes. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice echoing in my mind. I walked down the stairs quickly, my heart pounding. I called Lucas, my friend and confidant, asking him to come immediately. I told him everything I had discovered, and he, although skeptical, agreed to help me solve the mystery. When he arrived, we explained the plan to burn the violin in hopes of lifting the curse. Lucas and I went to the basement where we had prepared a place to burn the violin. As we prepared, the temperature dropped drastically, and the feeling of oppression increased. The spectral figure appeared again, this time clearer and more defined. "You cannot destroy what is trapped here," she said, advancing slowly. With a last burst of courage, I threw the violin into the flames. The figure let out an agonizing scream, and the entire house shook. The shadows around us twisted, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. Finally, the figure disappeared, and the temperature returned to normal. Lucas and I left the house, exhausted but relieved. We sat on the porch, trying to process what had happened. "Is it over?" Lucas asked, his voice full of hope. "I don't know," I replied, looking at the house. "But something tells me this is just the beginning." As we walked back inside, I realized something. The feeling of being watched had lessened but not completely disappeared. I knew that the house held many secrets and that my journey was far from over. The battle between light and darkness never ends, and I was prepared to face anything that came my way. In the days that followed, I continued to feel a presence in the house. I decided to investigate further, determined to discover the truth about the curse and the secrets the house held. Each night, the feeling of being watched returned, and I knew that the fight against the forces of darkness was far from over. I was ready to face whatever was lurking, determined to find peace for myself and the spirits trapped in the house. As I prepared for another night of investigation, I heard the sound of footsteps upstairs. I grabbed my flashlight and headed upstairs, determined to face whatever was watching me. Upon reaching the room, I saw a shadow move quickly, disappearing into the darkness. The battle was just beginning, and I was determined to win. As I prepared to face the presence that haunted the house, my mind was in turmoil. With every step I took, the air felt heavier and denser. The light from the flashlight cast elongated shadows on the walls, dancing to the rhythm of my rapid breathing. I entered the room where I had heard the footsteps, and the intense cold enveloped me. In the center of the room, I saw the indistinct silhouette of a spectral figure, shrouded in dense shadows. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. The figure slowly turned around, revealing a disfigured face and empty eyes that seemed to pierce through my soul. "I am the guardian of this place," whispered the figure, his voice echoing off the walls of the room. "You have freed a part of us, but the true essence of evil is still trapped here." I felt a chill run down my spine as the figure disappeared into the darkness. I knew the fight was far from over. He needed to find the source of this curse and destroy it once and for all. I decided to return to the attic, where I had felt the strongest presence. I climbed the stairs with determination, trying to ignore the fear that was taking root in my heart. When I reached the attic, I realized that something had changed. The shadows seemed thicker, almost tangible. In the corner, I saw an old chest, which had not been there before. I opened the chest carefully, finding a set of strange objects: black candles, a cracked mirror, and a diary with a worn leather cover. I picked up the diary and started leafing through it. The pages were full of notes from Joaquim Silva, the former owner of the house. "Today I tried another ritual," read one of the entries. "Music is the key to freeing trapped souls. I need to find the right melody to complete the ritual." My mind raced as I read the notes. Joaquim believed that music could free trapped souls, but something went terribly wrong. As I read, I heard the violin melody again, soft and melancholy. I looked around, trying to locate the source. The spectral figure appeared again, now clearer and more defined. "You must complete the ritual," she whispered, her voice thick with desperation. "Only then can we all rest." I took the cracked mirror and the black candles from the trunk, determined to follow the instructions in the diary. I went down to the basement, where the energy seemed stronger. I lit the candles around the stone circle in the center of the cellar and positioned the mirror in the middle. I started playing the violin melody in my mind, following the instructions in the diary. The temperature in the basement dropped drastically, and the shadows around me began to stir. The spectral figure appeared, this time accompanied by other indistinct shadows. "You're close," she whispered. Continues. I closed my eyes and continued to play the melody in my mind, feeling a growing strength around me. The shadows began to dissipate, and the spectral figure let out a scream of agony. "You did it," she said, her voice now filled with relief. "We are free." The figure disappeared, and the air in the basement became lighter. The feeling of oppression was finally gone. I picked up the remains of the candles and the cracked mirror, determined to destroy any trace of Joaquim's dark rituals. I burned everything in the backyard, watching the flames consume the evil objects. I went back inside, feeling a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. The house was finally free of the curse. I sat in the living room, reflecting on everything that had happened. I knew there were still many secrets to be discovered, but at least for now, the house was at peace. In the days that followed, I continued my investigation into Joaquim Silva and his rituals. I discovered that he had become involved with a sect that believed in communicating with the dead through music. His desire to bring back his family drove him insane, and he ended up trapped in his own curse. As I wrote about my experience, I realized that my journey was far from over. The house was free, but the stories I found here were just the beginning. My mission now was to document and expose the dark secrets I encountered, helping to prevent others from falling into the same trap. I returned to town and began sharing my story with residents, hoping to bring some peace and understanding to the community. The battle between light and darkness never ends, but as long as there are those willing to face the unknown, there will always be hope. The feeling of relief was palpable, but a subtle uneasiness still persisted. I decided that the house would not only be a resting place for me, but also a center for studying paranormal phenomena. He knew that the fight against the forces of darkness was eternal, but he was prepared to face any challenge that came, determined to protect the innocent and bring the truth to light. As I sat in the living room, reflecting on recent events, the sense of peace began to fade. The night deepened, and a growing restlessness took over me. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift unsettlingly, and the temperature in the house began to drop again. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a primal fear come back to haunt me. Suddenly, I heard a soft sound coming from the basement. Like the scratching of nails on wood, I stood up slowly. Each step felt like a challenge. I grabbed my flashlight and walked down the stairs carefully, the sound getting louder with each step. The air was heavy and thick, and the flashlight shook in my hands. I reached the basement and found it enveloped in darkness. The violin melody began to play again, this time louder and more piercing. "Who's there?" My voice echoed through the empty space. The shadows danced to the rhythm of the melody, and I felt a powerful presence around me. The spectral figure of Joaquim Silva appeared before me, his face distorted by pain and despair. "Did you think you could escape so easily?" he whispered, his voice full of mischief. Terror gripped me as he advanced. The shadows around him turned into indistinct figures, like lost souls trapped in eternal torment. "I tried to free you," I replied, my voice shaking. "Please leave me alone." "There is no peace for those who tamper with forces beyond understanding," said Joaquim, his figure getting closer and closer. "You didn't destroy everything. There is still a fragment of curse that remains. You're stuck here with me." The air grew colder and the shadowy figures around began to draw closer, their whispers turning into screams of agony. I looked around, desperately looking for a way out. My mind was racing, trying to find a way to escape this nightmare. I remembered the last pages of Joaquim's diary, where he mentioned one last object that could be the key to breaking the curse once and for all. I ran to the office upstairs, feeling the shadows follow me. The fear was overwhelming, but my determination was stronger. I found the diary and quickly flipped through the pages. There, I found the final note. The black mirror is the source of the curse. Destroying it is the only way to free us all. I ran back to the basement where the black mirror was still trapped among the rubble from the previous ritual. Joachim and the shadows were all around me, their presence suffocating. I took a heavy tool and, with all the strength I had, I broke the mirror into pieces. A shrill scream echoed through the basement, and a wave of energy swept through the space, dispelling the shadows and Joachim's figure. The walls shook, and the air seemed to vibrate with the force of the breaking curse. I fell to my knees, exhausted and in shock, as the darkness around me began to lighten. Finally, silence fell over the house. I stood up with difficulty, feeling true peace for the first time since I entered that place. I climbed the stairs, feeling the weight of oppression finally lift. The house felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. As I left the house, the dawn light began to illuminate the horizon. I looked back, seeing the house now peaceful, knowing that the curse had been broken. But the experience left me scarred, aware that evil can persist in subtle and unexpected ways. At that moment, I promised myself that I would dedicate my life to investigating and combating these dark phenomena, protecting the innocent and bringing the truth to light. And so, with a new purpose, I left the terror of the house behind, ready to face the next challenges that the unknown might bring. The Hotel Miragem, located in the heart of the fictional metropolis of Novella, had an elegant facade that hid many secrets. Built at the end of the 19th century, it had seen its heyday and decay, remaining now as a reliquary of ancient memories and disturbing energies. It was famous for its illustrious guests and, even more so, for the mysterious events that surrounded Room 214. It was in this room that Marcello, an insurance investigator, would find much more than he expected when investigating a series of suspicious fires. I arrived at Hotel Miragem on a cold night, with fog hanging over the streets, giving the atmosphere an atmosphere of mystery. The hotel's facade, worn down by time, still maintained an air of grandeur. I climbed the front steps and was greeted by the doorman, an elderly man who seemed to know more than he was willing to tell. My name is Marcello, and I'm here to investigate a series of fires that occurred in different hotels in the city. All of the incidents had one element in common. They started in room 214. My mission was to discover the cause of these fires and prevent them from happening again. He knew the task would not be easy, but he was determined to solve the mystery. At reception, I was greeted by Clara, the hotel manager, who gave me an old, heavy key to room 214. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Mr. Marcello," she said with an enigmatic smile. I thanked him and went up to the second floor. The hallway was dimly lit and silent, and each step seemed to echo off the walls. When I reached the bedroom door, I felt a chill run down my spine. Room 214 was known for its tragic history. It was said that decades ago, a talented violinist named Arthur had stayed there. He was going through a difficult period, and the pressure to compose a new piece drove him to despair. One night, Arthur was found dead in his room, holding his violin, and since then, rumors of his presence haunted the place. I opened the bedroom door and entered, illuminating the room with my flashlight. The room was exactly as I expected, old with dark wood furniture and faded wallpaper. The bed was covered in a heavy comforter and a rocking chair was positioned by the window. I put my suitcase down and started exploring. While taking photos of the room, I noticed something peculiar. The air seemed colder in there, and a faint smell of smoke hung in the air. I decided to set up my recording equipment to capture any anomalous activity. I prepared my notebook and began reviewing files from previous fires, trying to find any patterns that might help me. Suddenly, I heard a soft, distant sound as if someone was playing a violin. I stopped and paid attention, The sound seemed to come from the hallway. I opened the door and looked outside, but I didn't see anyone. The sound stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving me with an uneasy feeling. I went back inside the room and continued my investigation. As the night wore on, I began to hear other noises, light footsteps, indistinct whispers, and the soft creaking of the rocking chair. Each sound seemed to intensify the feeling of oppression that hung in the room. My hands shook slightly as I wrote down each incident, trying to stay calm and focused. Around midnight, I decided to get some rest. I lay down on the bed, but sleep was impossible. The feeling of being watched was constant, and the violin melody began to play again, this time louder and clearer. I sat up in bed, trying to understand what was happening. I looked at the rocking chair and, to my horror, saw an indistinct shadow sitting in it. "Who's there?" My voice sounded weak and shaky in the darkness. The shadow didn't respond, but the chair continued to rock gently. I stood up slowly and approached, my heart beating wildly. As I got closer, the shadow disappeared, and the chair stopped moving. Fear took over me, but curiosity was stronger. I decided to investigate the old closet in the corner of the room. When I opened it, I found an old wooden box with a dusty violin inside. I picked up the instrument, feeling a wave of cold pass through my body. The connection with Arthur the violinist was clear. I put the violin back in its case and closed the cabinet. The strange happenings continued. The lights flickered and the room's temperature seemed to fluctuate from hot to cold in a matter of seconds. Every time the violin melody played, I felt a presence approaching, as if Arthur was trying to communicate with me. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating, and I began to question my sanity. In the middle of the night, I heard the sound of something scratching at the bedroom door. I slowly opened the door and looked down the hallway. To my surprise, I found an old yellowed letter on the floor. I took the letter and went back inside, eager to see what was written. The letter was from Arthur, dated shortly before his death. "To anyone who finds this letter, know that my spirit is trapped in this room. My obsession with music has led me down a path of no return, and now I am doomed to wander this place. Please help me find peace. Burn the violin and free my soul." The message was clear, but the idea of burning the violin filled me with fear. However, I knew it was the only way to end the curse that haunted room 214. I picked up the violin again and with shaking hands took it to the bathroom, where I had left a box of matches. I lit a match and brought it close to the violin. The moment the flame touched the wood, a piercing scream echoed through the room and the violin's melody became deafening. The shadows on the walls shook violently, and the feeling of oppression reached its peak. I continued holding the match until the violin completely caught fire. The flames danced and consumed the instrument, and the melody finally ceased. With the violin destroyed, the shadows disappeared, and the temperature in the room returned to normal. I felt immediate relief, as if a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. He knew that he had fulfilled Arthur's last wish and that his spirit was finally at peace. As I watched the violin's ashes, I heard one last whisper, soft and comforting. "Thank you." The presence in the room dissipated, and for the first time that night, I felt like I could rest. I lay down on the bed and, with a calmer mind, I fell asleep. The next morning I woke up to the first rays of sunlight coming through the windows. Room 214 felt different, lighter and more welcoming. I collected my equipment and went down to reception. Clara was there, with a curious look on her face. "The night was interesting," she said, trying to hide the tiredness in her voice. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked, with an enigmatic smile. "I think so," I replied. "Arthur's spirit is at peace now." Clara nodded, as if she already knew what I had done. I thanked him for his hospitality and left the Hotel Mirajam, feeling that my mission was accomplished. However, I knew that many other mysteries still awaited me in other places. As I walked through the streets of Novella, a new determination came over me. My experience in room 214 taught me that the world is full of dark secrets and forces beyond our understanding, and I was prepared to face each one of them. no matter how terrifying they might be. The story of room 214 may have come to an end, but my journey was just beginning. And who knows, maybe one day I would return to Hotel Miragem, prepared to face new challenges and uncover other secrets that still remain hidden in the shadows. For now, however, I will continue my search, investigating haunted places and bringing peace to restless souls. And so, with Arthur's spirit finally at rest, I moved on, ready for the next mystery that crossed my path. As I left the Hotel Miragem behind, the sunlight began to illuminate the streets of Novella, dispelling the shadows of the previous night. However, the weight of my experiences in room 214 was still with me. The feeling that something beyond our understanding existed in that old structure remained vivid in my mind. Even with Arthur's spirit at peace, I knew my journey was far from over. The following days were intense research. I delved deeper into the city's archives, seeking more information about the Hotel Miragem and its possible connections to other paranormal events. I discovered that the hotel had been the scene of many mysteries and tragedies over the years, but none as disturbing as the story of room 214. As I reviewed my records, I realized that a new series of incidents were occurring at another historic hotel in the city, the Grand Hotel Lucerne. I decided to investigate, hopeful that I might find answers and perhaps even more clues about the origin of the supernatural forces that seemed to be so active in Novella. Upon arriving at the Grand Hotel Lucerne, I was greeted by the manager, a tall, thin man named Ernesto. His expression was serious, and he seemed to know more than he was willing to share. "Sir Marcelo, we are aware of your reputation and thank you for coming," he said, leading me through the luxurious lobby. "The events that have occurred here are disturbing." "What are the exact incidents?" I asked, writing down details in my notebook. Ernesto hesitated for a moment before responding. "Guests have reported unexplained noises, objects moving on their own, and some have even said they have seen strange shadows. All of this seems to focus on room 313. I felt a chill. Once again, one specific room seemed to be the epicenter of paranormal activity. I asked to be taken to room 313, determined to find out what was going on. Upon entering the room, I felt a sense of déjà vu. The decor was elegant, but there was a heavy and oppressive atmosphere, similar to that of room 214 at the Hotel Miragem. I began setting up my recording equipment and cameras, trying to capture any anomalies that might occur. While investigating the room, Ernesto told me an intriguing story. They say that many years ago, a famous illusionist called Victor Ravenscroft stayed here. He was on tour, and the Grand Hotel Lucerne was one of his stopping points. During his stay, he mysteriously disappeared, leaving only a cryptic letter and some personal belongings. I took the letter that Ernesto showed me. Victor's handwriting was careful, and the words seemed loaded with a hidden meaning. The ultimate illusion hides in the shadows of the unknown. Find the truth, and you will find me. I decided that Victor's letter could be the key to unlocking the mystery of room 313. I continued my investigation, trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. The hours passed slowly, and the feeling of being watched never left me. Around midnight, the phenomena began to intensify. I heard light footsteps and indistinct whispers, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop suddenly. The light from the lamps flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. I looked around, trying to find the source of the noises, but everything seemed to move outside of my field of vision. Suddenly, one of the cameras fell off the shelf, hitting the floor with a loud bang. I ran over to it, and as I put it back in place, I saw something that made me freeze. In the bedroom mirror, a nebulous figure was forming. It was the reflection of a tall man in a wide-brimmed hat. His eyes were pools of darkness. "Victor Ravenscroft," I murmured, recognizing the illusionist's description. The figure in the mirror seemed to be watching me, and a feeling of despair came over me. "You are looking for answers," said the figure, its voice echoing unnaturally. "But the truth is hidden in the shadows. You must follow the clues I left to find the final illusion." Suddenly, the mirror broke into 1,000 pieces, and the figure disappeared. The sound of the shattering was deafening, and I ducked, shielding my face from the shrapnel. When I got up, I noticed that one of the fragments of the mirror reflected something different, a strange symbol engraved on the bedroom wall. I approached the symbol and began to decipher it. It was a combination of letters and numbers forming a kind of code. I remembered Victor's letter and his cryptic words. The code seemed to be a clue left by him. I decided to pursue this new line of investigation, hopeful that it would lead to answers. I spent the rest of the night trying to decipher the code, which took me to a series of locations within the hotel. Each new clue seemed more complex than the last, but they all pointed to a single objective: finding the secret room where Victor carried out his illusionism experiments. Finally, around 3 a.m, I arrived at the hotel basement. The place was dark and damp, with the smell of mold and decay in the air. The walls were covered in symbols and diagrams, evidence of Victor's work. In the center of the basement, there was a large wooden box, similar to a coffin, with chains around it. I approached the box, feeling a mixture of fear and curiosity. Very carefully, I removed the chains and opened the lid. Inside, I found the mummified body of Victor Ravenscroft, still wearing his illusionist costume. Next to the body, there was an old violin, identical to the one I found in room 214 of the Hotel Miragem. I picked up the violin, and the moment my fingers touched the instrument, a wave of energy ran through the basement. The shadows on the walls shook violently, and an evil presence manifested itself. Victor's spectral figure appeared, this time more solid and menacing. "You found my secret," he said, his voice reverberating through the basement. But now he must pay the price for the truth. The room filled with an ominous melody, and the air grew heavy. The shadows around Victor began to move, forming grotesque figures that approached me. I felt intensely cold, and my body began to shake. I knew I needed to act quickly. I remembered what I did in room 214 and decided to use the same strategy. I took a match and lit it, bringing it closer to the violin. The flames began to consume the instrument, and Victor let out a deafening scream. The shadows around him twisted and slowly disappeared. When the violin finally crumbled into ashes, Victor's figure disappeared and the air in the basement became lighter. Silence returned, and I felt a sense of relief. He knew that he had freed Victor's soul, as well as Arthur's, and that the Grand Hotel Lucerne was free of the curse. As I left the basement, Ernesto met me at the top of the stairs, with a look of relief on his face. "You did it, Mr. Marcello. Thanks." I thanked him and left the hotel knowing that my mission was accomplished. Once again, I had faced the forces of darkness and emerged victorious. However, I knew that many other mysteries still awaited me, and I was ready to face them. As I walked through the streets of Novella, the feeling of being watched never completely left me. The fight against the unknown never ends, and I was prepared to face whatever challenge the future brought. The story of room 214 and room 313 may have come to an end, but my journey was just beginning, and with new determination I continued searching for answers, ready to face the secrets that were still hidden in the shadows. As I left the Grand Hotel Lucerne behind, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the streets of Novella. The feeling of relief at having freed the imprisoned souls was quickly replaced by a growing uneasiness. The experiences I had in the haunted rooms still haunted my mind, and the feeling that something terrible was coming never left me. Back at my apartment, I tried to relax and process everything that had happened. I sat down at my desk and started reviewing the notes and photos I took at the hotel. However, the ominous melody of the violin continued to echo in my mind, and the feeling of being watched intensified. Suddenly, I heard a soft sound coming from the living room. I slowly got up and walked over, my heart beating fast. The room was dark, lit only by the dim street light coming in through the window. In the center of the room, I saw something that made me freeze in fear. The doll that I had found at the Hotel Miragem was sitting on the sofa, with a sinister smile on its face. His empty eyes seemed to watch me, and the feeling of oppression returned with full force. "How is this possible?" I muttered, trying to control my panic. Before I could react, the lights began to flicker violently, and the room's temperature dropped drastically. I heard slow, shuffling footsteps behind me. I turned quickly and saw the spectral figure of Victor Ravenscroft, more menacing than ever. His presence filled the room with a feeling of utter despair. "Did you think you could get rid of me so easily?" he whispered, his voice echoing unearthly. "The curse never ends. You're stuck with it now." The doll began to move, its joints creaking ominously. She got up from the couch and started walking towards me, her empty eyes fixed on mine. Terror gripped me, and I knew I needed to act quickly. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife, trying to stay calm. The doll and Victor's spectral figure continued to get closer, and the feeling of oppression was overwhelming. I knew I needed to destroy the doll to put an end to the evil presence once and for all. With all my strength, I attacked the doll with the knife, tearing its cloth body. However, with each blow, Victor's figure became more solid and menacing. The shadows around him twisted, forming grotesque figures that seemed to watch me with hungry eyes. "You cannot defeat me," shouted Victor, his voice full of rage. "I am the curse, and you are destined to suffer for all eternity." Desperate, I continued attacking the doll, but it seemed futile. The shadows approached, and the feeling of intense cold increased. I felt my strength diminish, and despair took over me. Suddenly, I remembered the last page of Arthur Bellatrix's diary that I had found at the Grand Hotel Lucerne. I ran to my office and grabbed the diary, flipping through the pages frantically. I found the passage about the final ritual to banish the curse and began reciting it out loud. The shadows around me shook violently, and Victor's figure let out a deafening scream. The doll fell to the floor, motionless, and the room was filled with intense light. I continued reciting the ritual, feeling a wave of energy course through my body. Finally, with the last words of the ritual, Victor's figure began to dissipate, and the shadows disappeared. The room's temperature returned to normal, and silence reigned again. He falls to his knees, exhausted but relieved to have managed to banish the evil presence. However, he knew that peace would be temporary. The curse of the Hotel Miragem and the Grand Hotel Lucerna had been broken, but I was aware that many other dark forces were still lurking, waiting to be discovered. My fight against the unknown was far from over, and I was ready to face whatever challenges the future brought. As I stood up, one last shadow moved in the corner of my eye. I quickly turned around, but there was nothing there. The feeling of being watched never completely left me, and I knew that the real battle against the darkness was yet to come. And with new determination, I braced myself for the horrors that still lurked in the shadows, ready to face whatever was coming.